Hello, strangers. But it's funny, because you look kind of familiar.
This is story 108. When giving birth to my mother, my grandmother had a difficult pregnancy. I don't know all the particulars. All I do know is that when it came time to give birth, there were complications. Emergency surgery was needed, and at one point, my grandmother became one of those people who, in all technical senses, died on the operating table. She was dead, clinically speaking, for 17 seconds. But she revived and was able to hold my mother in her arms. We always joked that the guardian angel was only one of 3 of the gifts she brought home from the hospital, the first 2 being my mother, of course, and bragging rights. A running joke in our family was that when my grandmother passed, she would have 2 dates of birth and 2 dates of death on her tombstone. My mother thus grew up hearing over and over about the miracle of her birth and her mother's rebirth. Specifically, what my grandmother saw when she was dead. She recounted the story so many times in such great detail, even those who didn't believe in an afterlife were nonetheless intrigued and interested. If nothing else, the story, the accounting, was convincing in delivery. Grandma said that she saw a bright light, and in front of that light gradually formed a man with dark hair, an angel. The angel wore white robes that flowed and fitted from his shoulders. He had brown curly hair and clean shaven, which stood out, as men of that indeterminate age in my grandmother's time generally wore a mustache. His halo was a bend of light around him, and as he looked down upon her with a small flaming dagger in his hand, he simply said, come back now." My mother grew up on this story, the story of the angel that looked after her mother, and, as my grandmother assured her, would look after her as well, gave her such a feeling of contentment and peace. It should be no wonder that when my mother decided to get into writing children's books, the first idea she had was to write about guardian angels. I won't say that they made us Harry Potter money, but my mom was able to set herself up pretty well by continuing to write the series. It was carried in a lot of Christian bookstores and even a few secular ones, quite the feat. So by the time I came along, the story of the guardian angel who had literally ripped my grandmother from death's embrace was also, in a way, our lifeline and benefactor, the one who put food on our table and kept wolves from the door. Of course, my mother, being an artist of words, was never able to quite capture through any means or any hired illustrator what the guardian angel looked like. I think that frustrated her more than my grandmother realized. From the number of times I heard about it anyway, I knew it plagued her. And since my role in this family is the flaky art student granddaughter, well, one of my final projects, I decided, why not? I'll take a crack at trying to draw the guardian angel that looked after my family so lovingly. I didn't use a single photo reference. I merely reread my grandmother's words in my mother's books. Brown curly hair, clean-shaven yet old enough to have grown facial hair, broad-shouldered, white robe. the man I created on the canvas, the man I created in my head, simply didn't exist in any photo, any reference, not even so much as a passing resemblance to an actor or musical artist that I liked. When it was done and graded and returned, I presented the painting to my grandmother at her 80th birthday. The look of shock she had told me that I'd guessed as closely as it likely ever could be. She and my mom exclaimed over and over that that was it. I had captured him, even the jut of his jaw, the way I'd painted him looking down at the subject, an artist trick to make him seem larger than life. So moved was my mother that she insisted on using it in the next children's book about the character. And so she did, earning me my very first credit. Now, if I stop right there, it's a simple chicken soup for the soul kind of story. But that's not where the story ends. It had been some years since the book had been published and sent out, and surely there were others that came after it, sandwiching it comfortably somewhere in the middle of my mother's au revoir. Imagine my surprise when, opening my social media, the stripped-down bare version I used for professional reasons, I came across a DM from some woman in California. We lived in Nebraska, and while beautiful, I'd frankly never made the time to visit the Golden State. The woman's email opened perfunctorily enough, polite, telling me she wished that her message found me well. But what she said next absolutely stumped me. She wanted to know where I had found my reference picture, and if I would be willing to part with it. As I said, it'd been some years. I had to think. I had no way of knowing which picture she meant until I saw that she had attached something. A screenshot of one of my mother's books, open to the page with the painting I had made for my grandmother on it. Feeling slightly defensive, as an artist most of us do tend to start off on the back foot, I wrote back and simply specified what I'd already said here, that there had been no reference, that my grandmother's explanation of the man, down to the flecks of green in his hazel eyes, and the dimple that she could so clearly see from his clean-shaven cheeks, all came from a vision she had had while dead, before being brought back to life. I thought about, typed out, and then erased a line about how, surely though few believed in things like the afterlife and angels, I realized it was part of the defensive feeling I was having about being questioned about a painting that 100% came from my imagination, yet I had no way to prove that. But I certainly didn't need to bring doubts against my grandmother's claims into it to make some strange woman from SoCal feel any better. Feeling that concluded the matter, I sent the response, logged out of the account, and moved about my day. If I had any concern about coming across as too snippy, well, I figured at least that was over with, and I would be unlikely to hear from the woman again. But I was wrong. 8 hours later, she responded. And with her message were a couple more attachments that shed more light into her inquiry. She wrote, belatedly realizing she hadn't really explained her interest. Her own grandmother had recently moved to an assisted living facility. You may not know this, but one of the largest buyers of books about faith tend to be assisted living facilities. Something about the retrospective look of hindsight, trying to make sense of it all before you go, so to speak, likely has something to do with it. It was there that her grandmother had happened across one of my mother's books, and she'd found them charming enough to seek them out, reading through them diligently, chuckling at the little adventures of the children in the books, being led, protected, and taught by the guardian angel, all until she got to the 13th book, which happened to be the book featuring the portrait I had made of him, the guardian angel. And there she had raised her hands to heaven, crying out, thank you, God. He made it there. Because surely the painting that I had made was the spitting image of her departed husband. A treacly tale, and one that I would have discounted if not for those attached photos I mentioned. Because after I read that message, and I got that sort of bittersweet taste, how nice a painting I made gave someone peace, I scrolled, and staring back at me was the man of my imagination, the dimple, the flecks of green, the curly hair. It was him. It was him exactly, even at the way I'd guessed he'd have a somewhat full upper lip. I was stunned, and sure enough, in reviewing her first email, I understood the likeness was so uncanny, so exact, that surely I must have used a photo reference, a photo of her grandfather that none of them had ever seen. And so she'd written just to see if she could recover both the picture and a means to find more of them. I wrote her back. I didn't know what else to do, simply stating that I was stunned, but again, I swore that the man in my picture had come solely from my grandmother's words, her testimony of when she had died on the operating table. I sent it off, not sure I could wait another 8 hours. I didn't have to. 2 hours later, the response I got back was a single line that sent a bolt through me. Instead of being an answer, it only brought forth more confusion. Was this in Omaha? Yes, it was. But how could she know? I called my mother, asking her while she had written the story time and time again, had she ever given those details in any of her books? My mother, sounding puzzled and a little concerned, told me no. She'd never had cause, in fact had sidestepped mentioning any location, so that any child could feel that no matter where they were in the world, an angel could be there for them. Something quiet in me told me not to explain myself, not just yet, until I had my own understanding of what was going on. You must understand, this story was family lore. I'd grown up on it. It was as cherished an heirloom as a Ming vase. And here I was, communicating with some woman I'd never met, had no relation to, who lived states away, who somehow reached out from the dark and upended that vase with a simple question. How could she know my grandma had died in Omaha? Now, I had written back, how could you know that? Nothing else. Ironic given how testy I'd been at her first message being just as abrupt. But with multiple smiley faces, the woman explained that her grandfather had lived in Omaha most of his life. More to the point, he'd worked at a hospital. You guessed it, the same hospital that my grandmama had gone to give birth to her daughter, my mother. And that man's job? Anesthesiologist. The last face you see before you're put under. She didn't need to explain more than that. It all made sense in an instant. Of course. She was going in for surgery, a scared young woman, afraid to lose her life, terrified to lose the life growing inside of her. In the confusion and the drowsiness and the medical-grade drugs hitting her system, how easy must it have been for her eyes, her senses to conflate, a kind man standing by her side, the bright OR light behind him as an angel with a fiery halo. Even the phrase he'd uttered, come back now. Didn't that sound just like a doctor prompting a patient to begin breathing again, to return to consciousness? Something about that story seemed settled, content. A framed painting on the wall, leveled and hung straight finally. But then another thought. My mother, my grandmother, to a challenge to this family heirloom of lore. My mind felt dizzy trying to figure out what the right of it was. To never tell my mother and grandmother, and thus withhold from them the truth of their own origin, or to tell them and maybe rob them of a belief of something greater, stronger than them, that looked out for them. As I mused on what to do, my eyes fell on the clock on my laptop, and I saw the time and realized I was late. I packed up my laptop and I headed back to campus. There was some event going on in campus. I think they had some international students visiting. We were a pretty high up there medical school. To that end, it was hard to find parking because half of our parking lot had been cordoned off to allow for the buses to pull through, as their length required that they took 2 slots lengthwise. I finally parked in the boonies, packed up my bags, and started scuttling diagonally across the parking lot. Now this next part may be coincidence. I'm still not sure. But as I burst through another row of the buses, all of them gleaming in white, from behind me, I heard something. Come back now. It didn't sound far away, but right up in my ear. And so stunned was I that I did in fact stepped back and turned around, wondering which of my friends had snuck up behind me. But when I turned, there was no one there. Odd, but harried though I was, I turned on heel to continue scampering across the parking lot to get to class. And just as I faced forward again, felt the whoosh of a white Cadillac SUV blast past me. So while I would love to think that I had solved the family lore, tidily tied a bow on top of Grandma saw the anesthesiologist, Grandma mistook him for an angel, Grandma came back, and, luck of the draw, that guardian angel lived on as more of a metaphor. Well, then who, in his calm voice, used his words to stop me from dying that day?
Like the video if you liked it, comment if you have something to say, and subscribe if you'd like a notification every Tuesday, and random holidays as decided by me. Instagram and email are in the description as always. And again I say, stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.